The hiring manager didn't even bother to lift her eyes from her desk. With a dry tone, she muttered a line that sounded like she'd repeated it 100 times that day. "We're not hiring." Felix Adams stood frozen for a second, his fingers tightening around the edge of his resume until his knuckles turned white. His mind went blank. Those 5 words, so simple on the surface, hit him harder than any failed business meeting ever had. This was the company he had built from nothing. He still remembered those early days, flipping burgers side by side with his friends, mopping floors after midnight, serving customers with a smile while calculating supply costs in his head. Over the years, that one small restaurant had grown into a statewide chain of 5 locations, a name that once stood for respect and integrity in the fast food world. And yet, here he was, denied a job at his own business. No interview, no questions, not even a glance at his resume, just a stranger at the door. Felix had stepped back from day-to-day operations a few years ago. He had entrusted the hiring, the training, and the general management to a corporate team he believed in. His role had shifted to strategic oversight, checking reports, approving expansions, ensuring the vision stayed on track. But lately, the cracks had started to show. Customer complaints about rude staff were on the rise. Employee turnover was abnormally high. Sales, once reliably steady, were slipping more and more each month. When he pressed his district manager for answers, all he got in return were empty reassurances, wrapped in corporate lingo. Felix knew better. Something deeper was rotting beneath the surface, and for the first time in years, he didn't trust the numbers anymore. He needed to see it for himself. So he went undercover. No cameras, no corporate memo, just a man with a plan. He let his beard grow, dyed his hair to a dull brown, and traded his tailored button-downs for a worn-out hoodie and jeans. None of the frontline employees had ever met him in person. To them, he was just another older guy looking for a paycheck. The plan was simple: apply at all 5 locations one by one and witness firsthand what his company had truly become. But at the very first location, that plan almost fell apart. "I'm pretty sure you're hiring," he said calmly, gesturing toward the now hiring sign still taped to the front window. The manager, a woman in her mid-40s with weary eyes and a sharp tone, let out a sigh like the conversation was already exhausting her. "Not anymore." Just then, the door swung open. A young man in his early 20s strolled in, earbuds still hanging around his neck, hands in his pockets, oozing casual confidence. The manager's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her eyes lit up, her voice softened. "Hey, Jason. You here for the job?" Jason shrugged. "Yeah, thought I could use some extra cash." "You got it. You start next week," she said with a smile. Felix clenched his jaw, a slow burning frustration rising in his chest. He had just been brushed off without a second thought, and yet this kid walked in and was hired on the spot? No resume, no questions, no hesitation, just familiarity. He didn't argue. He didn't push. Instead, he gave a polite nod and walked out. There were still 4 more stores to visit. Maybe one of them would be different. But the second location was no better. This time, the manager was a man named Derek, likely in his late 30s. To his credit, he at least glanced at Felix's resume. "You got any experience?" Derek asked casually. "I've worked in restaurants before," Felix replied. "Cashier, prep line, kitchen, fast-paced stuff." Derek let out a sarcastic snort. "Yeah, I don't think you'd fit in." Felix raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Derek leaned back in his chair, giving Felix the kind of look people usually reserved for used appliances. "You're just a little old for this kind of work." The words didn't explode, they sliced. It wasn't the ageism alone that hit Felix hard. It was what it implied. that the company he built no longer valued experience, no longer saw potential in character or grit, only in appearances. He said nothing more, just turned and walked away. But as he stepped outside, the tension in his chest didn't fade. It hardened. Yes, he was in his early 50s, but that didn't mean he couldn't keep up. In fact, he knew from years of experience that he could work faster, more efficiently, and with more focus than most of the young, untrained hires flooding through the doors. And yet when he had pointed to the "now hiring" sign out front, Derek had simply shrugged, as if age alone disqualified him. Something was deeply, dangerously wrong, and Felix was just getting started. "We're looking for someone younger, quicker," the manager said, as if age were some kind of unforgivable offense. Felix didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, but as he passed the kitchen area, something made him pause. The chaos was undeniable. Employees were darting from station to station, drenched in sweat, trying to keep up with a flood of orders. It was obvious the restaurant was severely understaffed. And yet, they had just turned down an experienced applicant, just because he wasn't young anymore? Something was deeply wrong, something rotting from the inside. The third store brought with it a fragile flicker of hope. The manager here was a young woman named Riley. Unlike the others, her eyes held sincerity, and her smile, tired but genuine, carried a kind of warmth Felix hadn't seen in a long time. "We're seriously short-staffed," she said as she took his resume. "It's great you came in. Would you be available to start training tomorrow?" Felix blinked in surprise. It had all happened so easily. "Absolutely. I'm ready." She nodded. "Great. I'll start your paperwork." "Welcome to the team." Felix walked out of that store with something unexpected stirring in his chest. A small, cautious kind of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, not every location was broken. But the fourth store quickly crushed that hope. He had barely stepped inside when a heavy-set man named Greg waved him off, with all the concern one might show a buzzing fly. "We don't need anyone," Greg muttered flatly. Felix glanced around. The line of customers stretched nearly to the door. Behind the counter, only two overwhelmed workers struggled to keep up. He furrowed his brow. "Are you sure? You look understaffed." Greg gave a half-smirk. "We're fine." Felix stepped aside and silently observed. Within just 10 minutes, he watched Greg berate an employee for being too slow, ignore a frustrated customer, and then casually pull a burger from the kitchen and retreat to the back to eat, leaving his staff floundering in the chaos. Felix didn't need to see more. But the fifth store, that was the breaking point. The manager here was a woman named Sandra. She didn't even finish reading the first line of Felix's resume before tossing it aside like it was trash. "We're hiring," she said coldly. "Just not you." Felix frowned. "Why not?" Sandra folded her arms. Her voice was flat, indifferent. "We only take referrals. If you don't know someone who works here, don't bother." Felix stared at her, stunned. "So, you're not hiring based on experience or qualification?" She smirked. "Nope." He drew a long breath, steadying himself. 5 locations. 4 of them had turned him away for reasons that made no business sense. The staffing crisis was obvious. Employees were burned out, unsupported, and suffering under negligent leadership. He had planned to stay undercover for a week. That plan was over. The next morning, Felix returned to the third store, the only one that had accepted him. He wore a faded t-shirt, worn sneakers, and a cheap baseball cap pulled low over his brow. Riley greeted him with a tired but genuine smile. "Glad you're here," she said, handing him a uniform shirt. "We need all the help we can get." Felix looked around. The kitchen was short-staffed. The front register had a line of customers snaking toward the door. The drive-through speaker was crackling non-stop with new orders. The pressure in the air felt like it could burst at any moment. "Is it always this hectic?" he asked as he changed into his uniform. Riley nodded. "We're supposed to have at least 3 more people per shift, but corporate barely sends anyone. When someone quits, we don't get replacements. We just have to make do." Felix's frown deepened. What she was describing was the complete opposite of what upper management had been reporting to him. "All right," Riley said, pulling him toward the kitchen. "I'll show you the fryer, easiest place to start." The kitchen was dated and tired. The floor was slick with grease stains. The fryer hissed and sputtered like it hadn't been cleaned properly in days. Felix mentally noted every detail. A teenage boy named Marcus was hunched over the grill, moving with robotic precision. His face was blank, his eyes heavy with fatigue. Nearby, an older woman named Linda shuffled between stations, clearly struggling to keep up with the overwhelming pace. Felix rolled up his sleeves and jumped in. This wasn't unfamiliar. Years ago, before any corporate titles or expansion plans, this had been his life. His hands quickly became dusted with flour. Sweat dotted his forehead. The heat from the fryer wrapped around him like a cloak. But he moved swiftly, falling into the rhythm of the kitchen like it was second nature. Riley shot him a look of surprise. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Felix gave a small nod. "A long time ago." She didn't press further, too busy trying to keep the line moving. Orders were flying in, they had no room for small talk. But as the shift wore on, Felix began noticing something troubling. Riley wasn't just assisting, she was running the entire store. "Where's the manager?" he asked between batches of fries. "Darren?" Riley scoffed. "He says he works remotely. We're lucky if he shows up once a week." Felix didn't react outwardly. But inside, a fire was building. A manager who was never on site, while employees struggled to stay afloat. No wonder turnover was through the roof. Suddenly, Marcus let out a sharp hiss and dropped his spatula, clutching his wrist. "I burned myself," he muttered, his voice strained. Riley rushed over. "Let me see." Marcus shook his head. "I'm fine. Just give me a minute." Felix saw the burn, an angry red mark, spreading fast. "You've got burn cream and bandages in the first aid kit, right?" he asked Riley. She hesitated. "We're supposed to, but Darren hasn't restocked it in months." Felix felt a sickening twist in his stomach. A kitchen without basic first aid. That wasn't just irresponsible, it was dangerous. Riley placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Take 5, I'll cover you." But Marcus didn't budge. "We're already behind." Felix saw it in the boy's eyes. Exhaustion, yes, but also something heavier. Resignation. How many times had he pushed through pain because he felt replaceable? Because he thought rest was a luxury he couldn't afford? It wasn't more than just a burn. It was a symptom. And Felix was finally seeing the disease. Felix didn't hesitate. "Take a break. I'll cover for you." Marcus nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. Felix stepped in without missing a beat, his hands moving with practiced ease, though his thoughts were racing. There were just too many things wrong. Employees were being pushed to the brink, safety protocols were ignored, and management was nowhere to be found. When the last customer finally walked away from the counter, Felix knew with certainty the disguise had served its purpose. It was time for the truth to come out. He stood in the now quiet kitchen, the background hum of the exhaust fan mixing with the low murmurs of exhausted co-workers. Riley was wiping down the counter, her movements slow and heavy. She let out a long breath, like one she'd been holding in for weeks. "That was brutal," she said with a faint laugh, dry and brittle, the kind born from chronic fatigue. Felix nodded, his eyes glancing at the clock. His shift was almost over. He had originally planned to work for a few more days undercover to gather more information, but after everything he'd just seen, the negligence, the injustice, the exhaustion, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He turned to Riley, his voice low but resolute. "Can you call Darren? Tell him it's urgent." Riley furrowed her brow. "Why? What's going on?" Felix looked her straight in the eye, his gaze firm but filled with quiet trust. "Just trust me." After a few seconds of hesitation, Riley nodded and pulled out her phone. Less than 10 minutes later, Darren strolled in, wearing a pricey polo shirt, designer sunglasses resting on his collar, and the relaxed air of someone showing up for a golf game rather than a workplace emergency. "What's the emergency?" Darren asked, barely glancing around the room, clearly oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Felix took a slow breath, then pulled off his cap, brushing a hand through his graying hair. "The emergency," he said, voice clear and unwavering, "is me. I'm Felix Adams, the founder of this company, and today, I just finished working a full shift in one of my own restaurants." The room froze. Riley's eyes widened in disbelief. Marcus, just returning from the back, stopped mid-step. Linda dropped the tray she was holding. Darren let out a nervous chuckle, trying to save face. "You're joking, right?" Felix didn't smile. "No, and I want to know why my employees are working in these terrible conditions while you barely show up." Darren's face went pale. We've been short-staffed." Felix cut him off. "Because you refuse to hire. Because you don't stock basic medical supplies. Because you've left Riley to run this entire store alone while you collect a paycheck and disappear." Darren opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it again. Felix turned to Riley. "I want a list of every employee who's been overworked, underpaid, or mistreated. And starting now, this store will get the staff it needs." Riley stared at him, stunned. But then her eyes lit up, not with disbelief, but with something far rarer. Hope. She nodded, this time without hesitation. Felix faced Darren once more. "You're done here. Pack up your things." Darren's mouth opened, his voice shaky. "You can't just—" "I can," Felix interrupted, "and I just did." Darren glanced around, hoping for backup, but no one stepped forward, and so, with a mix of shame and defeat, he turned and walked out. The heaviness that had weighed down the store began to lift. Marcus exhaled slowly. Linda allowed herself a small, relieved smile. Riley looked at Felix, her eyes filled with something that hadn't been there before. Trust. "It's about time," she said quietly. Felix nodded, "and this is just the beginning." He stood there, watching the doors swing shut behind Darren. The silence that followed wasn't suffocating anymore. It was filled with anticipation. Something was shifting. Riley was the first to speak. "So, what happens now?" Felix didn't hesitate. He had seen enough. He had felt the rot in his own creation. Now, it was time to rebuild from the foundation up. "Now, I want to hear from all of you," he said. "I need to understand what's really been going on, what's broken, what's driving people away." Riley nodded, then turned to the team. "Everyone, let's take a break. We'll close the dining room for a bit. Drive-through will stay open." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. His voice was quiet but laced with hope. "If we're really changing things, can we talk about pay?" Felix met his gaze. "That's exactly what I want to talk about." They gathered in the prep area in the back, crumbs and sauce stains still visible from the earlier rush. Their faces showed the weariness they no longer had to hide. Linda, the oldest among them, folded her arms. "I've been here nearly 6 years. My pay hasn't gone up once." Felix listened, his expression turning solemn. Marcus added, "We never get performance reviews." Darren used to say we would. It never happened. Riley chimed in. When someone quits, they're not replaced. We just get stuck doing extra work. Some days we're running this place with half the staff we need. Felix remained silent, letting it all sink in. He had suspected things were bad, but hearing it from the mouths of those who kept the company alive, it hit differently. It was no longer a management issue. This was systematic neglect. Linda continued. The equipment's falling apart. That fryer smokes if you use it too long. And the freezer? It leaks every night. We have to mop it up before morning shift. Felix glanced over at the freezer and saw the damp rags shoved underneath, still wet. Riley pointed toward the register. Even our software's outdated. It crashes all the time. Customers get mad, and we're the ones apologizing for problems we can't fix. Felix took a long, steady breath. These weren't minor inconveniences. These were organizational failures. Failures under his watch. Why didn't anyone report this? He asked. Riley let out a dry laugh, more bitter than amused. We did. Nobody at corporate listened. Felix's chest tightened. He had promised himself this company would never treat people like machines, but somewhere along the way, that promise had been broken. He looked around at each of them, his voice firm. This ends now. Everything you just told me, none of it is acceptable, and it's going to change. Marcus looked at him cautiously. How do we know you'll keep your word? Felix didn't blame him. After all those years of being overlooked, who would still believe in promises? Oh, prove it, Felix replied, starting right now. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It only rang once before the person on the other end picked up. We need to talk, Mark. Where are you right now? Mark's voice was hesitant. Is something wrong? Very. Meet me at the Elm Street location in 30 minutes. Felix ended the call and turned back to the team. While we wait, I want a list of everything that's broken, outdated equipment, software, anything slowing you down. Riley immediately grabbed a pen and notepad. Marcus began listing items, and Linda added more one by one. By the time Mark arrived, Felix was holding 3 full pages of tightly written notes. Mark stepped in, straightening his tie, trying to keep his composure. But the moment he saw Felix standing among the employees, not in the office, not behind a desk, his eyes flickered with unease. Felix held up the list. You know what this is? Mark shifted uncomfortably. A list? It's everything that's broken in this store, and everything these employees have endured while being ignored. Mark grimaced. I didn't realize things were this bad. That's the problem, Mark. You should have... Mark swallowed hard. I'll start looking into it. No, Felix cut him off. You're not just looking into it. You're going to personally oversee every repair, every hire, and every overdue raise for long-term staff. Mark started to speak, but one look at Felix's face silenced him. He gave a reluctant nod. Felix turned back to the team. I'm not done. You've carried this company on your backs while upper management look the other way. That ends today. Linda straightened up. Marcus glanced at Riley, a quiet hope in his eyes. This wasn't just talk anymore. For the first time in years, it felt like something real was happening. Felix stood at the center of the restaurant, the heart of the empire he once built, surrounded by the very people the system had forgotten. The truth had come crashing down, but there was no time for regret. It was time to act, not for reputation, but for the people who had fought every day to keep his original vision alive. He turned to Riley first. Through all the chaos, she had been the only one holding the place together. Staffing shortages, broken equipment, absentee leadership, she handled it all. The exhaustion was still visible in her eyes, but now there was something else behind it. A quiet glimmer of hope. Felix knew he couldn't just patch things up. He had to rebuild, and that began with the right people. He looked Riley in the eye and said simply, As of today, you're the official manager of this store." Riley froze. Her fingers tightened around the notepad in her hands like she was afraid it might vanish. Her voice wavered but remained composed. "Are you serious?" Felix nodded firmly. Darren had abandoned his role. Riley, without any formal title, had done the work of an entire leadership team. Leadership isn't about titles, it's about action. And Riley had earned it. The other employees exchanged glances, as if waiting for some hidden catch. But Felix assured them there was none. No catch, no tricks, just well-earned recognition. And with her new title, Riley would receive the proper salary she'd long deserved. For a moment, the room changed. The air shifted. Riley didn't say a word, but the quiet smile on her face and her tear-glossed eyes said more than anything could. Marcus muttered softly, almost to himself. "Finally, someone sees what she's done." Felix heard him, and he agreed. Wasting no time, Felix turned to Mark, the district manager. There was no room left for excuses or delays. Change needed to happen not just here, but across the board. He issued clear instructions. Every store needed to be fully reviewed, not on paper, but in person. Staffing levels, working conditions, equipment. They needed real reports, not sanitized versions from disconnected managers. Mark nodded, but Felix wasn't finished. For employees who've worked here for years without a raise, without performance reviews, they'll be compensated. This company has been profitable, but the people who keep it running haven't seen those profits. That changes now. Linda finally spoke, her voice steady. "How do we know this won't just fade away again?" A simple question, but it carried weight. Felix understood her doubt, because he had once made promises to himself that he'd failed to keep. "I'm not disappearing again," he said. "I'll be showing up unannounced. I'll talk to people directly. I'll walk into kitchens, look at reports myself. No filters, no layers, just me." The energy in the room shifted again. The skepticism hadn't vanished, but for the first time, truth was beginning to settle into the room. Felix continued. "Hiring practices are changing. No more picking favorites, no more hiring based on who knows who. Positions will be filled based on real needs with urgency. No more one person doing the job of three." Riley stepped in, direct as always. "That all sounds great, but we're still short-staffed right now. We're still using broken equipment every day. We need help immediately." Felix nodded. "I know. I'll pull in temporary staff from other regions. And as for the equipment, I'm calling the supplier today and demanding overnight delivery. No waiting." Mark stood still. By now it was clear. This wasn't a consultation. This was a reform. Marcus glanced at the clock, then at Felix. It was time to reopen the dining room, but no one wanted to break the moment. Felix looked around at the group. "Take an extra 10 minutes. After everything you've been through, you deserve it." Linda leaned against the counter, exhaling for what felt like the first time that day. The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by something tentative but undeniable. Hope. Riley set her notepad down and asked gently, "What about the other stores? The ones that turned you away, the ones ignoring the problems?" Felix met her gaze directly. "No one's getting overlooked. Everyone responsible will be investigated, and if needed, they'll be replaced." Riley nodded. She believed him, not because of his words, but because of the actions he had taken since the morning. Felix stepped outside and pulled out his phone. His first call was to the equipment supplier. Every broken item would be replaced immediately. No waiting, no excuses. Overnight delivery was not optional. It was mandatory. The next call was to the regional hiring coordinator. He made his message clear. Current hiring policies had cost the company valuable talent. Every store that was short-staffed needed reinforcements, not just the one he had worked in. All of them. Inside, Riley and the team returned to their stations. but the energy had shifted. They no longer moved with the defeated slump of people just trying to survive the day. Now they had reason to believe things could actually get better. Felix quietly observed them. He saw how they moved in sync, how they backed each other up, how they handled the stress with solidarity instead of resentment. They weren't just working for a paycheck, they wanted this place to succeed, and that truth made the mismanagement they'd endured even more painful. A short while later, the restaurant doors swung open. Felix recognized the woman instantly. Sandra, the manager, who had coldly rejected him at another location. She didn't notice him right away. Her face was drawn with irritation, and she walked straight to the counter, demanding to speak with someone in charge. Felix stepped forward. She turned, and the moment of recognition flashed across her face, followed quickly by discomfort. He didn't waste time. "Why did you refuse to interview me?" Sandra hesitated. I was just following protocol. We screen carefully to maintain high performance." Felix raised an eyebrow. "High performance? When you're understaffed? You tossed out my application without even reading it. How many other qualified people have you turned away like that?" Sandra shifted uncomfortably, falling back on the usual scapegoat. "That's what upper management requires." But Felix didn't let her sidestep accountability. He made it clear the hiring process across all locations would be reviewed, and any manager who rejected applicants based on personal bias would face consequences. Sandra's face hardened. She understood. This time there would be real repercussions. After she left, Riley remained nearby. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes said everything. She now knew his promises wouldn't stop at talk. That evening, the next shift began. The new employees who arrived had no idea what had happened earlier in the day. Felix used the opportunity to speak with each of them about last-minute schedule changes, inconsistent overtime, and the general instability of their work environment. He took notes on everything. When the clock passed midnight, Felix was still there, helping close up shop. He wanted to see the entire process for himself, from opening to final cleanup. He stood in the quiet restaurant, taking it all in. What once was just a cell on a spreadsheet now held the faces and voices of real people, people who had been forgotten by the very system he created. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Felix left into the night with a heavy heart but a renewed determination. There were still more stores to visit, more wrongs to make right, but the first step had been taken, and from here, everything would change.